Hello, good morning. I'll speak in English for obvious reasons. Uh, can I start, Bia? Yeah, okay. So, good morning, everybody. I was telling them that we are Swiss in terms of punctuality. So, to make my promise good, we are starting at 9:30 on the dot. Let me just start by saying many thanks to the German embassy. Where's Michael? Here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to have such outstanding German scholars with us today. Well, the information that they were coming came at short notice, but I did not hesitate a minute to take the opportunity and say yes to your offer. So thank you so much. And thank you, both of you, Professor Merkel and Professor Miller, for being here. We've been focusing on the same topic, the crisis of representative democracy, populism, and the like, for the last 3-4 years. We have invited outstanding scholars from the U.S., Larry Diamond, Stephen Levitsky, from France, Pascal Perrineau, and so it's high time that we have German scholars here to talk about this very same topic, which is very dear to us, to this foundation, at the core of our political and intellectual concerns. In both of you can make I think a significant contribution to the public debate here in Brazil. So I hope this is the first of various meetings here. You have a permanent invitation to come back. And without further ado, I'll turn the floor to Professor Merkel, who starts 30 minutes. Then Professor Miller will have 30 minutes more, and then we can have a Q&A session. Floor is yours, Professor Merkel.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Thank you for coming. I'm completely astonished that on a Friday morning so many people show up.
Me too. Me too.
So let's not go into the explanation of that.
Oh,
So I take this one, yeah. So, but you heard already good morning, so I don't have to repeat it. And I immediately start with my presentation. I'm talking a bit about right-wing populism seen from an European perspective, and I try to link it to the question whether right-wing populists are a problem for democracy or even a threat, or there may be even a corrective. So I leave these questions open for my presentation and for the discussion certainly as well. These are more or less the 5 steps which lead me through my talk, a kind of cognitive map. I will talk at the beginning which are the topics, the themes right-wing populists are mobilizing, are stressing. And you see there is a certain change of these topics. The second one is, who are these right-wing populists in Europe, which is the social structure, for example, of the electorate and the membership. And then I will confront you with an explanation why these right-wing populists are so strong at present in Western and Eastern Europe, and why I do think this is not just a transient phenomenon. I have certain strong arguments, I believe, that they will stay with us. And then the question I already mentioned, threat or therapy for representative democracies. And do we know something about anti-populist strategies? We can imagine some, but what do we know empirical about empirical impacts these strategies have, and I can immediately add to this, we do not know very much about it, and this is strange. So I present some possible strategies against right-wing populists. Here I have a sequence of themes. Right-wing populists were mobilizing on, and most of them who started in the 1970s began as anti-tax parties and anti-EU parties, but especially against anti-tax parties, and they emerged in Scandinavia, where you find strong tax states on the one side, and also still up to now the best democracies on the globe. However we measure it, they appear always at the top ranks of these rankings of democracies. In the 1980s, they stressed stronger their critique of the European Union when the European Union intensified the integration. They argued this is not the future of our country, of our countries. We do not want to have such a strong European Union, and also some of them propagated to leave the European Union. This is certainly a topic which is hot discussed in these days, as you know, if it comes to the British case. But then in the 1990s, more right-wing populist parties emerged on the European continent, in Western Europe, but also in Eastern Europe. You find one of the traits which are the strongest one. They are anti-liberal. They are anti-liberal, and they are opting against multicultural societies. So they have the idea there should be homogeneous societies, and I have immediately to add ethnically homogeneous society. This is at least something which never left their programmatic package. And after the year 2000, and this can be now observed in Germany as well, it is especially against Islam. It's not only against migration, it is especially against migration from Muslim countries. They do not want, they want to close the borders against refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. And what is quite interesting, and we did some computerized analysis of many electoral party programs. Most of these parties started as neoliberal parties, but now they moved to the left. They became what one can call socially protectionist parties. These are very bad news for social democratic parties, because right-wing populist parties now are to some extent the workers' parties in Western and Eastern Europe. So these are more or less the four topics. I'm sure Jan Werner will talk about this as well. Here you see the upswing. The upswing, and look at the blue lines at the beginning. You see the upswing of the electoral success. It is not so dramatic, one might find, however, from the 1980s or the early 1990s, you see a steep increase in the electoral share for right-wing populist parties. Eastern Europe is certainly, in Eastern Europe, you find stronger right-wing populist parties than compared to the West. And what is quite a difference, you have at least in two countries right-wing populists governing as the dominant coalition partners in governments. And we have to discuss whether maybe right-wing populists in opposition are a complete different thing compared to right-wing populist parties in governments if we talk about the impact on democracies. If women would take a revenge about the political discrimination throughout the 20th century and proposing to suspend male suffrage for at least 10 years, we may solve the problem. We may solve the problem of right-wing populist parties because they are, to a large extent, male-dominated. But the more they gain votes, the more women will vote for them as well. But still, these are basically strong male-dominated parties. For example, the parliamentary group of the German right-wing populists, AfD, they have only 10% of women among their parliamentary representatives. If it comes to education, you see the green line are the lower education, the middle education are the orange columns, and the blue ones, they have a tertiary education, meaning a university education. And basically the middle education and also the middle income. The lower middle income are those who are voting for right-wing populist parties in Europe. Are they concentrated more on the countryside, or do you find right-wing populist supporters more in urban areas? Again, here, the neighborhood in big urban cities or the supporters are not so numerous than in middle-sized towns and on the countryside. This is going to change in some of the European countries as well. So, the typical right-wing populist voter is male, rural, small towns, and has a lower medium income, and the opposite is clear as well. Those who are not voting for right-wing populist parties, and in many West European countries, the direct oppositional force against right-wing populists are the Green Party, the ecological parties. They have high education, the supporters high education. And as you see in a moment, they have complete different worldviews than the right-wing populist supporters. And this is why I think these parties will stay with us, and where I see a new cleavage and conflict line running through most of the Western and East European societies. And I call, and my colleagues from Berlin as well, we call these different oppositional camps, on the one side cosmopolitanism and on the other side communitarianism. Before I come to this cleavage, I will just briefly explain who are the cosmopolitans. The cosmopolitans among the population are basically the winners of globalization. They are among the elites, or let's put it this way, we did empirical research, and the elites are almost completely cosmopolitans, meaning they are opting for open borders in economic transactions, but also open borders for refugee and asylum seekers or workforce, and also open borders for state or national sovereignty. So they are in favor that the nation state gives up sovereignty right to supranational regimes and organizations such as the WTO or especially the European Union. They consider citizenship not only as a nation-state-based citizenship, they declare a global citizenship simply by being human. So this is a complete different understanding of what citizenships mean, and one of our colleague from the London School of Economics has ironically called them, these are the frequent flyers of our societies. They can live basically everywhere. And you find it especially among the high educated urban middle classes. So the communitarianists are in many regards the opposite. They tend to be the losers of globalization. They come from the lower education strata. They very much insist that the nation state has to be strong. The nation state has to protect them, and they are critical against the European Union. They want to control and to close the borders as much as possible. They think there should be a guiding culture within the societies, meaning that migrants and refugees coming to the societies have to adapt to the indigenous cultural traditions of those societies. Just briefly mentioning, there are two versions of these communitarians, meaning they want to rely on a fixed community or a political community, to some extent also to an ethnic community. By the way, this is an old idea of social democratic parties. The Swedish Social Democrats invented in the 1930s what they called people's home, meaning a high solidaristic society with high redistribution by the tax and social state on the one side, however, on the other side, closing borders. And you find this quite interesting, especially at present in Denmark. This is a classical case of these communitarianism, highly solidaristic, quite a few institutions which organize redistribution and fostering a strong welfare state. But you have a nasty, so to say, normatively spoken, nasty version of this communitarianism, and this is a nativist, nationalist, right-wing populism. And as I have said, what I see at least, or our analysis hint at, is that they're becoming, to some extent, chauvinist, social protectionist supporters of their societies. Again, these are, the German sociologist Max Weber would say, ideal, typical constructions. They mark the end of the cleavage. And if you control yourself, you will immediately see, maybe I have both of these types in my consciousness. I can be against neoliberal economics, but being very much in favor opening the borders for refugees. These are the green supporters, for example, in Germany. So think about the more, however, people can be located at the end of this axis, what I call a cultural cleavage between cosmopolitanism and nationalist communitarianism, the more these parties will have a future, because they can mobilize along such a conflict line. Are these right-wing populists a threat? Let me distinguish between politically, normatively, and functionally. Politically, it depends very much, as I have said at the beginning, whether these populists are in opposition or they stay in government. If they are in opposition, they may function as a corrective to an obvious representational gap left open by the established parties. The established parties then have to win back those voters who went to right-wing populists. If you are in government, then you may change already the institutional fabric of the political regime. And if they are in government, it depends whether they are the junior partner in such a governing coalition, as it is the case sometimes in Scandinavian countries, as it is the case in Italy at present, or in Austria, or if they are the dominant partner in government where they can guide the governance of their country. And I do see a difference whether, and this may be for Latin America relevant as well, if right-wing populists operate within well-established, stable democracies, or they operate within not so consolidated democracies. And the less these democracies are consolidated, the more harm they can do at the government. Poland and Hungary are certainly exemplary cases. Normatively, this seems to me clear, and I already have hinted at this is highly problematic. They are exclusive because they want to exclude people from citizenship which are not born there. They do not want to leave them in. They frame the discourses very much along ethnic and nationalist lines. And this is something which is changing in Europe very strongly. Not only the nation state, but nationalism is coming back to some extent into these countries. So from a normative point of view, it is a major threat to democracy. However, from the functional point of view, which is quite interesting, is they activate political discourses. There is less apathy. They bring back the lower and lower medium classes into the political arena. We may discuss that they do it under negative signs. However, there is an intensified discourse, and the discourse really focuses on elementary questions of the society and democracy. And some of you may know two theoreticians who clearly distinguish between right-wing populism and left-wing populism. And the basic difference is that left-wing populism, they talk about the people as well, but they talk about the people not in nativist terms. They talk about the people as the have-nots. They talk about the people as the lower classes, which become a subject in politics and in history, and they have a positive perspective on populism or left-wing populism. Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe are certainly the most eminent theoretician who arguing that way. They argued now they change the elitist discourse and they bring these people back into the political arena, thereby filling a representational gap. So what we are witnessing at this time is a repoliticization of the discourses, however, also to some extent, now I'm back at the right-wing populism, to some extent, this leads to some extent to a polarization of our society. So on the one side, activating discourses, but on the other side, the people may not really listen to the other side. Just to give you, again, an example out of these two camps, the communitarians and the cosmopolitans. The cosmopolitans tend to be, let's say, consider themselves as having the truth as well. And they are moralizing politics. And they may have good normative reason for it. I emphasize, certainly. However, they tend to be exclusive as well. And the more, this is certainly a thing we can discuss, the more you moralize politics, the less you may be able to forge compromises. And this drives, to some extent, the polarization of our societies. I come to my last point. What do we know about anti-populist strategies? If we assume that right-wing populists is normatively a threat to democracy, it harms especially one dimension of democracy, not that much the participatory dimension, but very much the dimension of the rule of law, the inclusiveness, and the sensibility versus minorities. And most of these strategies we already have seen, but as I have said, we do not have a systematic evidence about the impacts they have. And I only go through the left column about the action, and I don't talk about, it would take too long, about the risks involved. The one idea is, why not banning these parties? This would be something in a German tradition, even the Constitutional Court is very reluctant to do it, to ban these parties because they are enemies of the constitutional order of the political system. Actually, it happened only 2 times in the history of the Federal Republic of Germany. One time against a Nazi follower successor party, and one against the traditional Orthodox Communist Party, both in the 1950s, and then we did not have seen it anymore. Isolating them, not talking to them, not inviting them to talk shows, not giving them so prominent news as it happens on the one and the other side of the Atlantic. Certainly not that easy, because the media cannot be commanded by governments, and the media sell these news, and this is, nobody knows it better than Donald Trump, who used it very much. So to say, or to ignore them, just to do nothing report. They do not really exist. This was at the beginning in Germany, but it changed then quite fast. Another idea coming very often from green, ecological, or social democratic parties, why not to change the topic? Move it away from the migration question, move it away from nationalism, transform it in socio-economic topics. This is a nice idea, and I am very skeptical that this will work, since I have shown to you there is a left-right distributional cleavage, but there's also a strong dynamic cultural cleavage as well, and you cannot simply talk about health, talk about pensions, talk about unemployment benefits, and let the people forget about migration, about multiculturalism, and so forth. However, we do not know sufficiently about it. Co-opting themes, so to say, co-opting, for example, the migration question and reformulate it in more moderate terms, in less racist, xenophobic terms, but be keen and saying we do not want to have very many of them. To some extent, this is a Danish strategy I have talked about in the beginning. Adapting these positions could be another one, so to say, if you can't beat them, join them. This is very close to co-opting, and what we see more and more and more, that traditional parties are coalescing with them. Here the idea is, if these populist, right-wing populist parties are in government, they have to be responsible. They cannot be just irresponsible opposition claiming things which nobody can really materialize in government. So these are some of the strategies one can think of. Nevertheless, and I repeat it, and with that I finish my brief presentation, we do not know very much about empirically, and this is certainly one of the things we have to do and we could do as political and social scientists, since in more than, or now 12 countries in Europe, right-wing populists were stayed already in government. Thank you very much for your patience listening to me.
I also thank you very much for the invitation, in fact a generous permanent invitation, which I hope will still stand after my remarks this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, you all know that the word populism has become ubiquitous in global political discourse. It's not just actors on the right, but also plenty of actors on the left who are nowadays labeled as populists. Even poor Emmanuel Macron, at one point in 2017, was called a populist. It was said at the time that he was a populist of the extreme center. This raises, of course, the question of what exactly all these different populists are supposed to share, if it's not really policy content as such. Against this background, what I want to offer you this morning is, first of all, some observations about what a more precise definition or understanding of populism might look like. I secondly want to address the question of what populists in power tend to do, and I will focus on those situations where they really have power. So to pick up what Wolfgang was saying, situations where these are clearly the dominant actors and not just the junior partners. And then lastly, I'll say a few words about what you might call anti-populist strategies, which have been very tempting for liberal Democrats, but which I think we can actually be pretty sure about don't work. And then, if you don't mind, I'm also going to mark two differences with Wolfgang, because otherwise people are always going to say, oh, always the same, homogeneous discourse by these liberal elites up on the podium. So I'll try to pick a fight, to liven things up a little bit. So what is populism anyway? Well, the conventional wisdom today, of course, is that populists are those who criticize elites, criticize the establishment. On one level, it seems obvious. On another level, you might say, it's actually a very strange thought. Up until recently, any old civics textbook would have told you that being critical with the powerful, be it in politics, be it in the economy, be it in culture, be it anywhere really, is a sign of good democratic engagement. Come the 21st century, we're told day and night that people who are actually critically minded are somehow possibly dangerous for democracy. Clearly things cannot be as simple as that. It's true that when populists are in opposition, they criticize sitting governments and other parties. But they also always do something else. They claim that they, and only they, represent what populists typically call the real people, or also the silent majority. This might not sound so bad. This is not immediately the same thing as racism or, let's say in the European context, a fanatical hatred of European integration. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, this claiming of a monopoly of representing the real people is bound to have two detrimental consequences for democracy. First, and perhaps rather obviously, populists will then also say that all other contenders for power are fundamentally illegitimate. And this is never just a question about policy or even a disagreement about values, which after all is completely normal, ideally even productive in a democracy. No, populists in a sense always make it completely personal and completely moral. The issue is always from the get-go that the others are simply corrupt or, to coin a phrase, crooked characters. What Trump did in the presidential campaign 15-16 vis-a-vis his main opponent was, of course, in many ways extreme. But I don't think that it was an exception. All populists engage in that kind of rhetoric. Secondly, and maybe less obviously, populists are also going to say that all those citizens, all those, if you like, among the people themselves, who do not share their symbolic understanding of who constitutes the real people, and who therefore also doesn't support populists politically, that with all these citizens, you can put into doubt whether they truly belong to the people at all. Let me try to illustrate this perhaps less obvious point with two examples. Many of you will remember the, perhaps for many of you, traumatic night of Brexit, at the end of which Nigel Farage, leader of the UK Independence Party at that point, said that this had been, as he put it, a victory for real people. Implying, of course, that on one level, the 48% of British citizens who wanted to stay inside the European Union, well, on one level, aren't quite real, do not properly belong to the British, or maybe in Farage's specific case, the English people. Or an example from an otherwise pretty much unremarked on campaign speech by the man who now occupies the White House. In May 2016, Donald Trump said, I'm quoting from memory, "The most important thing is the unification of the people. And all the other people don't mean anything." I hope you can see where this is going. What matters about populism is not anti-elitism. Any of us can criticize elites. Doesn't mean we're right, but this is not in and of itself a danger for democracy. What matters about populism and is a danger for democracy is anti-pluralism. It's the tendency always to exclude others at the level of party politics, pretty obviously, less obviously at the level of the people themselves, where the populist leader basically decides these are the real people, and even if you happen to hold an American, a German, maybe a Brazilian passport, you still don't truly belong to the proper people. Allow me to draw out one implication of this account that might have particular relevance, certainly in the country where I live, as we are moving towards the next presidential election. If you find anything worthwhile in what I've been trying to get across so far, you might have thought that populists who lose elections or who don't gain overwhelming majorities have a pretty obvious problem. How can it be that on the one hand, they and only they represent the real people, and on the other hand, they don't win? It's a logical conundrum for them. There is a, I would say, typical, but not always to be found strategy with which populists who lose tend to address this problem. What they very often do is to essentially argue, look, by definition, if the silent majority were not silent, then we would always already be in power, because we are the only ones who represent the real majority. So if we don't win, maybe it's time to take another look at the silent majority And what we find is that actually we're not talking about the silent majority, we're talking about the silenced majority. Somebody must have been manipulating something behind the scenes to prevent us from winning. It must have been rigged. Many of you will remember Trump's remarks in the run-up to the 2016 election, where he said, if I'm going to accept her win, I'll tell you at the time. Everybody understood what that really meant. There were some surveys that show that up to 70% of Trump supporters said, if Hillary Clinton wins this election, it must have been rigged. I think that's a bad number for any democracy, because it basically shows that a large part of the citizenry have decided that the institutions are so rotten that you basically can't trust them at all, and this distrust is then purposefully fed by populist politicians. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we can never criticize our electoral systems and institutions, especially but not only in the US. There's plenty to criticize, from campaign finance to gerrymandering and lots of other stuff we could talk about. But there's a difference, ladies and gentlemen, between a view that advances these general criticisms and somebody who in essence says, our system is rotten because I didn't win. And against this background, it's at least worrying, to put it mildly, that Trump is already building up a scenario leading up to 2020, where he says, well, lots of illegals could be voting again. And by the way, as he did most recently, I'm friends with the military, have you noticed, and also the bikers. I'm not sure how the military feels about being put in the same category as, the bikers, but never mind. So it's already, again, moving towards a scenario where an election can possibly be put into question. Swiftly on to the second chapter of my remarks. What do populists do when they get into power and really have power? A very common view, it seems to me, among broadly speaking liberals, is that these actors have such horrendously simplistic ideas about policy, that once they get into power, they're going to find that all their demagogic promises can't be kept, all their policies don't really work, so either they moderate, they become more rational somehow, or they stick with their crazy policies, which then automatically fail. Their supporters are going to see that things fail. So either way, the problem solves itself in one form or another. Or a kind of variation on this thought, all populists are against the elite. Once these actors are in power, they themselves, of course, have become the elite, so they cannot continue their anti-elite discourse, and they will have to abandon it, they will have to normalize somehow. So again, the problem solves itself. It's a very comforting thought, and I think it's profoundly mistaken. We have enough examples in our era of populists in power who not only can govern, but who can govern specifically as populists, which is to say, as actors who do not fundamentally recognize the legitimacy of an opposition. And to name just some of the most obvious ones in the European context, Hungary and Turkey. Turkey is in Europe, but also Poland. If you want a left-wing example, I don't need to belabor the point which country in Latin America right now would be an obvious example of left-wing populism in power having led to an obvious disaster. But think also of maybe less obvious examples like Modi, who is not simply a kind of proponent of neoliberalism, but also has clearly defined the real Indian people along basically Hindu nationalist lines. What all these cases, it seems to me, show is that there is, by now, something that you might even perversely call a populist art of government, a set of techniques with which these politicians consolidate their power, and where, by the way, they can also learn from each other in terms of how you basically go about implementing this art. Allow me to just pick out a couple of these elements of this art of populist governance. The most obvious, I guess, is that all these populist actors are always going to push back against any criticism from independent institutions, be it constitutional courts, be it free media, by always saying, we are elected, you're not, and furthermore, we are the only ones who truly represent the people. This is by no means new. I'm not saying this is a great innovation. Napoleon III in the 19th century pretty much already said the same thing about the French press that criticized him. But there are a couple of other things that arguably are more innovative. First, all these actors, where they've had enough power and countervailing forces were too weak, have essentially occupied, hijacked the state itself, have tried to replace what in theory at least should be non-partisan civil servants, bureaucrats, with partisan actors. And, this is crucial, always in the name of their basic claim of we are the only ones who represent the people. Because you're going to say lots of other parties kind of try to do that. It's not specifically populist. But they can do this quite openly with the argument that, look, the state is there for the people. We are the only ones who represent the people. So if we take the state, it's the people taking the state, and there's nothing illegitimate about that. Second element, mass clientelism. Again, you're going to say plenty of parties engage in mass clientelism, not specifically populist. True. But again, populists are going to do this with a specific kind of claim. Remember that from the get-go, not all citizens are the people. Only some people are the real people. So if only some people get benefits, bureaucratic favors, and so on, that's not something to be ashamed of. That's exactly how things should be. Thirdly, and perhaps rather obviously, if there is pushback, if there is protest from civil society against these populist governments, I think by now it's clear that all of them tend to follow a playbook that was arguably first worked out by Vladimir Putin. Whenever people appear on the streets to speak out against populist governments are going to say, these aren't really citizens protesting against us. What you see out there, of course, has all been paid for, manipulated, engineered by outside forces. And then, you can draw on a wide range of usual suspects. It's the CIA. George Soros is always a favorite in these contexts. But really, there are no limits to creativity. Some of you may remember the Gezi Park protests in Istanbul, people protesting against the restructuring of the area around Taksim Square by Erdogan. What did the Turkish government inform us of kindly? Of course, they came out and said, look, these aren't real citizens protesting against this policy. Everything has been organized, obviously, by Lufthansa, the German airline. Why? Because Erdogan was, of course, also building this fantastic new airport, which was giving another boost to Turkish Airlines, which, as Morgan Freeman is telling us in all these great ads, is a fantastic airline anyway. So Lufthansa was really concerned and hence paid all these people to come out. Notice how, again, beyond the obvious realpolitik element here, there is a symbolic dimension why populist politicians have to do this. If you say, we and only we represent the people, by definition it cannot be true that other people are really against you. So you have to also morally and symbolically delegitimate protests as much as possible. And maybe it's worth belaboring the point that, of course, it's entirely legitimate for governments to push back against the pushback and to say, look, we're elected. You're just demonstrators. Of course you can voice your dissatisfaction, but if you want something radically different, you got to wait for the next election. And by the way, these are the justifications for our policies. That's completely normal democratic politics. But if a person in response to protest says, or rather tweets, that these are all paid-up activists, as Trump did, that is not a normal democratic reaction. Because you are basically saying, there's nothing for us to discuss. I'm not even going to justify my policies to you because I don't recognize you as legitimate actors. You are just basically fake citizens out there who don't represent anything or any legitimate opposition. All right, swiftly on to my very last chapter. I just want to pick out what I take to have been two very typical ways in which, broadly speaking, liberals have tended to react to populism that I think can be highly problematic. First, if you are confronted with, let's say, a president who lies at least once a day, might sound familiar to you as well. It becomes very tempting for liberals to say, look, the situation is obvious. We have the truth. We have rationality. They always do fake news. They're always lying. It's always demagogues and so on. I mean, if you just need to, open the New York Times any day of the week and, you have a pop-up that says, if you care about the truth, subscribe today. And of course, the truth is always 40% cheaper, every time you click on this, thing. It's very tempting to go down this road. But where is it going to lead us? I think it's going to lead us to a distinctly technocratic stance. By technocracy, for shorthand, I mean actors who say there's really only one rational policy solution. If you disagree, you basically reveal yourself to be irrational, you haven't understood the complexity of today's world, there's really nothing for us to discuss, also there's nothing to debate in parliaments, there's only one rational solution that has to go through. Why is that so problematic? Well, it's partly problematic because it provides a great opening for populists to come back and say, what do you mean there's only one solution? Where are the people in this? We thought democracy was about choices. So if in doubt, it's likely to embolden populists further. And what's going to happen next? If populists become stronger, technocrats are going to become even more technocratic because they're going to say, look, you give people a choice, they bring crazy people to power. So we should ideally give people even less of a choice. More gatekeepers, more restraints on what we throw open to democratic decision-making. And guess what? If technocrats become stronger, the populists become stronger again. So we're caught in a complete vicious circle, potentially. And the irony is also that while this might look like now, we have two extremes, technocracy against populism, ultimately, these two stances actually have one important thing in common, because they are both forms of anti-pluralism. The technocrat says only one rational solution, nothing to debate. The populist says only one real people, only we represented. If you disagree, you're a traitor to the people, nothing for us to discuss. Whereas I would hold that basically normal democracy happens in between, where you have choices, where you recognize the legitimacy of adversaries, but where you also basically accept the point that democracy, as shocking as it might sound, isn't really about truth. It's about different opinions that obviously have to be constrained by facts, but these are situations where we can legitimately disagree. Which brings me to my very last point. Especially, but not only, if you follow political discourse in the United States today, of course you are confronted with an endless series of lamentations about polarization. Oh, our society is so divided. It's particularly culturally divided between, flyover country and the bi-coastal liberal elites. And this is terrible. And we need sort of a healing of these divisions. And ideally, we're going to have candidates for 2020 who are quasi-therapists who can heal us. I mean, wait a minute. Division in and of itself, even polarization in and of itself, is not the end or even a threat to democracy. If we didn't have divisions in our societies, we actually wouldn't need democracy. If everything was always automatically consensus, why do we even have political struggles? They're completely legitimate, as long as the adversaries recognize each other as legitimate, which is, if you find anything worthwhile in what I've been trying to say, is precisely what populists do not do. But division in and of itself is not the problem. A further problem then arises if one gives in to the temptation of buying the argument that ultimately all these divisions are really cultural or are about ways of life. People very often nowadays say, look, the problem is with these arrogant liberals, who are really, of course, condescending towards rural America, who make fun of, Appalachian hicks, hillbillies, all these kinds of things. And by now, plenty of liberals have said, yes, mea culpa, I'm now going on what sometimes is ridiculed as a Trump safari. So, you go to these places, you look at the native population, and pretend to be very sympathetic and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that cultural differences don't matter. I'm not saying that everything can be reduced to economics. My plea, though, is to be much more careful with these cultural interpretations. First of all, I think it's very doubtful whether many people actually truly in their lived experience encounter forms of disrespect like the ones I've just presented to you. What they do encounter for sure is something else. They encounter talk radio and Fox and all these other great media organizations which day and night tell them that they are being disrespected. Because it turns out polarization is also big business. And it feeds on itself and it creates the very divisions of which it then lives. Secondly, lots of takes or interpretations of so-called left behind places are still much better understood through basic socioeconomic factors. What's typical of left behind places, at least in the United States? Well, to begin with, it's very difficult to get to them. It's partly the deregulation of the American airline industry, which led to a situation where to get to these rural places is enormously expensive, sometimes more expensive than to fly across the Atlantic. What also led to them being left behind are basic regulatory decisions, economic decisions about basically the end of real community banking, which used to play a very important role in these sorts of places. What also is important is, to put it very bluntly, but I think not inaccurately, that local economic actors did a great job in terms of lobbying to convince people that we all share a certain form of life. So, prime example, a place like West Virginia, where 30 years ago people would have said, look, I'm a coal miner, but my kids should not be coal miners because this is an incredibly dangerous and unhealthy thing to do. Then lobbying organizations come on the scene and they say, we're all friends of coal. You know, this is our common way of life. Never mind the owners don't of course actually work in these places or even live in these places. But this is our way of life. And it's the arrogant liberals, the Obama environmental protection guys who come and attack our way of life. And once, you reframe things like this, once you take out what would have been obvious even 30 and 40 years ago, that, here is whatever, the coal miners union, and the owners are actually our enemies on a certain level, once you reframe things in the right kind of way, the overall constellations change. And all I'm saying is that we should not too quickly buy into these narratives about cultural divisions. Okay, if I may, just two things to maybe open up a debate among us. So I completely agree on how you describe the importance of new cleavages. The one thing I would slightly push back on is this. How exactly do we describe what some of these positions amount to? You said it's ideal types, it's not meant to be faithful to any, obvious empirical reality. But if we use, in my view, very loaded terms like open borders, I think, again, we should be careful. At least I am not aware of any political party in the Western world that is of any consequence that actually advocates anything that could meaningfully be described as open borders. German Greens don't say, let's, basically abolish the German nation state right now for good. And I partly worry about this because it can lead to a kind of fake equidistance, where the reasonable centrist says, well, of course I'm against open borders, but I'm also against, the racists on the other side. But the one position, as far as I can see, doesn't really exist. Nobody really says, let's abolish borders entirely. For that matter, actually also nobody really says globalization is about global justice. As far as I remember, globalization was always justified in the name of the national interest. People said, this is great for everybody. Or they said, like Tony Blair, we have to do this anyway. Debating globalization is like debating whether fall should follow summer, nothing we can do about it, we have to adapt it. But as far as I remember, nobody really gave a normative story about, this is sort of going to be great for, every human being around the world. Maybe you see it differently, but that's where I would be somewhat careful, just in terms of how we describe this new and emerging landscape. So I'm not entirely sure I've succeeded in picking a fight, but that's the best I can do for now. Thank you.
If you agree, I will proceed as I normally do here, which is to collect some questions, and then you reply to them all at once.
Can I have a chance to respond
course,
very,
of
very
course. No,
briefly?
then
And
you
I
go-
will
then you-
not
then
take
you go
time
first.
away in order to deepen the disagreement.
Feel free to do so.
Okay, of course, nobody argues open border or completely closed borders. This is a matter of degree. But I would argue if in 2015 in Germany, if there would not have been such an influx of refugees and asylum seekers and migrants, we would not have seen the birth of such a chauvinist, right-wing, populist party. So Max Weber again distinguished between, so to say, ethics of consciousness and ethics of responsibility. And you may be, on the one side, on the consciousness side, having a clear ethic, and there are many arguments for it, but it may have consequences which completely run against your normative ethics. So I see cases where you have in Germany, in Sweden, and Austria in 2005, you had a non-controlled influx. Even in normative terms, I'm very much in favor of a multicultural society. But if a country or if a government, if a state argues we cannot do anything as the German government did, then the people ask, why should we have these elites in the government? Big, big mistake. And the second last point I want to mention here, Jan, you said about right-wing populists are moralizing politics. I agree. But at the same time, the Greens and parts of the Social Democratic Party, where I feel myself close to, are moralizing exactly with the same intensity. If you use the term in the academic spheres or in the what one can sometimes call hyper-liberal sphere, if you are saying this may have been a problem that the Merkel government did not close the borders after the first weeks, then you are immediately a chauvinist, a racist. You are excluded from the discourse. And this is what happened. The same with gender things. They may be completely wrong, but they are not allowed to talk. And this is water on the mills of the right-wing populists. And because both sides are moralizing that much, this cleavage will stay and will stay as a cultural one.
All right, very good. So, who wants to ask questions, please? Here. Please identify yourself shortly and make a concise question.
Let me to introduce myself. I am Alberto Amaral Jr., Professor of International Law at the Faculty of Law of the University of São Paulo. First, my question is directed to Professor Merkel. Which are the most likely things for European politics to the rise of populism in the near future? Second, my question is directed to Jan. And you emphasized the relevance of pluralism as being intrinsic to democracy. And the lack of pluralism has been a characteristic of populism. But some cases are easily identifiable when you state the absence of pluralism. For example, when you deny the legitimacy of a political opposition. But there are other situations, gray areas. For example, free speech in the United States and in the European Union. How to understand the real limits of free speech, to comprehend and to understand how broad should be a polity to realize pluralism. My question is, how much suppression of pluralism is necessary for populism to consummate?
Good. Anyone else wants to ask a question? Here, ladies first, then you go.
Thank you. My name is Marina Gibson. I'm a law student in the master's degrees program of the State University of São Paulo, and I have a question. It can be for both professors. How can an unstable and recent democracy like Brazil deal with the changes proposed by the right-wing populists that aims to withdraw the fundamental rights from minorities, which some of their proposals at the National Congress aims to reduce the rights of some population, like women and the LGBT people and all these cases, and why, from a normative view, there is a relevant reason to moralize politics by both sides.
Good. Ian, Angela, I think we're going to have 2 rounds of questions here. So,
A very simple question. Roberto Teixeira da Costa. I'm from the Gacinte and the University of São Paulo. What is the worst for democracy? Populism of the right or populism of the left?
right. So since this is
I know which answer you want to hear.
well, since this is a short question, Ian, and then Angela, and then we close and we come back to the thing.
I'm Jan Eichbaum, Consul General of Luxembourg. My question is, when the democracy, and I think I want to have an homage today of what happened in Christchurch in New Zealand, that 48 or 49 Muslims were killed in the mosque yesterday. When actually actions such as this and other far right or far left actions happen where actually people are hurt and people are killed, and this is actually, you know, when you go above and beyond the theory and to actions where you actually disregard minorities.
Angela.
I'm Angela Alonso, professor of University of São Paulo and president of SEBRAP. I have two questions for both of you. One, I'm using the microphone, but it's not working.
No, it's working, but speak louder.
Okay. So I'd like to ask you about the utility of using the concept of populism nowadays. It's an old concept. It has been used to talk about many different situations in many different times. So I'm wondering why to come back to this concept that's a losing one, and rather than create a new one or to discuss the case by case and then construct a new concept to talk about this new reality. So that's my first point. The second one is, can we talk about this, what we could define as right-wing politics, without talking about the left-wing politics? Is not those political debates are always relational. So ones are talking about or against the other side. So I'm wondering if you could say something about this relationship, because it seems to me that the right wing has been pushed to this moral debate because they do not have more the real socialism to talk against. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about those points. Thanks.
And finally, why do you think populism has come to stay? What are the factors behind it? Does it have anything to do with the capitalism in its new form, or not?
These are very interesting questions, and I certainly cannot answer all of them, and Jan will do at least as I can do a good job on answering it. The first one on the European Union. What can the European Union do against the illiberalization of certain member states? I'm extremely skeptical that the European Union can do very much, even if there are legal norms which would allow them to do it. In the moment where the European institutions try to intervene into the nation states in these matters, the member state, they will only increase the ressentiments against the European Union among broad, certainly not all, but broad sectors of the society. And if the European Union massively try to stop the Polish or the Hungarian government to colonize the judiciary and to discriminate against NGOs, the regime will use it and will argue these are illegitimate external interventions into the domestic matters. So I'm very, very skeptical about that. What is the difference between, or let me add the following. The European Union is extremely unpopular at the moment in many, many countries. And if they would, let's say, massively intervene in Hungary or Poland, they will get a reaction, let's say, from the Italian government. And they are very much afraid of a domino effect. If Great Britain leaves the European Union, others could do it as well. So the European Union is in a highly complicated situation at the moment, and therefore they are not the most potent actor. What is the difference? It comes out of different question. What is the difference between left-wing and right-wing populism? In theory, I think the difference is quite easy. Right-wing populism is exclusive on ethnic and cultural and religious terms. Left-wing populism, in theory, tries to bring in the marginalized sectors of the society. This is at least a claim. Those who were not represented, who are not the winner of the economic development, they claim to bring them in. So on theory, they are socioeconomically inclusive. In practice, and Jan mentioned this, in practice at least they have two things in common. The first one is they embark on a majoritarian idea of democracy. The winner takes it all. The winner, and even if the winner is only one with 50.1, or in the Trump case of 49, not the real winner, but they claim to have the legitimacy to decide on that. And the second point is they are quite critical against intermediary organization of representative democracy. They are critical against political parties, they are very critical against parliaments, and then they tend to destroy if they have the power. And this is certainly one point we have seen in Venezuela, which I would consider no longer a real left-wing populist party. This has become a hardcore left authoritarian regime. I do not see so many populist claims now under Maduro. So I insist there is a difference between left and right-wing populism. Since I was flying in this morning, leaving yesterday Germany, I have not heard the latest news about New Zealand. This is certainly where Jan can say something. A last point, it goes to, I think your name was Marine, the law student. The minority protection. This is a kind, certainly, of a litmus test for the quality of democracy. But what is at stake in the United States as well is how strong institutions are. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant once argued, a good republic is one where the institutions are constructed in a way that they can even govern a people of devils. And then he adds, if they have reason. So why should then the institutions not hold against the devil in government? Why should the institution of the US political system not hold against Donald Trump? And I see some indicators that these institutions hold. However, in countries which do not have such a strong and long democratic tradition, and I would not only subsume at the end Germany, but certainly Brazil, among these cases as well, these institutions may not so deeply rooted in society, and they may not be so able to keep somebody who is a governing devil, so to say, within the boundaries of democratic constitutions. So I still see a difference between the United States and Latin American democracies.
So all excellent, i.e. extremely difficult questions. Alberto, I'm not going to sit here now and give you in 5 seconds the uniquely, universally valid theory of free speech. What I'm going to say is that, first of all, maybe it's worth underlining that, yes, there's no such thing as a non-pluralist democracy. At the same time, pluralism is not a first-order political value like liberty, equality, maybe dignity. So this is a different point than people who say, oh, the more pluralism, always the better. You know, as much diversity as possible is always the best possible world. And against that background, I think it's maybe worth saying that there can be a reasonable pluralism about pluralism itself. In other words, different countries, against the background of different historical experiences, different political cultures, come to reasonably different views. So Germany bans parties. Greece doesn't ban party, even though nowadays it clearly has a kind of neo-Nazi party on the scene. Well, they drew different lessons from a history of dictatorship, and they are both reasonable things to say. They just lead to different outcomes. But I think we as theorists could not from on high say that, oh, one is normatively obviously wrong and the other one is obviously normatively right. And I think broadly speaking, that also applies to free speech. On the whole question of what to do, I'm reluctant to kind of, now hand out 3 bullet points about all you have to do is this and this and this. But 3 suggestions on the basis maybe of the experiences of other countries that have seen the rise of populist actors and then also populists in government. One thing that I think has been very important is how exactly the opposition presents its role. I think a typical mistake has been to end up in a situation where an opposition no longer makes clear the difference between, on the one side, normal policy disagreements. Okay, the government wants this, we're the opposition, we explain why we were against it. That's the normal stuff of democracy. As opposed to, on the other side, basically a situation where we're no longer talking about the content and the outcome of the game, but changes in the rules of the game itself. In the US, it's become very typical that defenders of Trump say, look, whatever he does, the Democrats never like it. So I stop listening to really what they say because they're always complaining, etc., which is an indication that maybe they haven't always done a good deal in terms of marking the difference between normal policy disagreement, where not everything is the end of democracy. So the end of the Affordable Care Act, one can regret, one can be for. That's not a question that touches on deep issues of democracy. Voter suppression, that goes to the heart of how democracy is supposed to work. So I think it's an art of making that distinction as clear as possible. Secondly, this is obviously a very facile thing to say, but given that these right-wing populists, I think always in one form or another engage in culture war. In a sense, that's their political business model. That's what they want to do. They want to rile people up. They want to say, here are the real people with their symbolic markers. Here are those who don't really belong. As I tried to hint at in the talk, I think for many people that's actually not really part of their lived experience, which is another way of saying the media are extremely important. And I don't want to lecture you on the importance of WhatsApp and how, in a sense, it's become possible to bypass traditional journalists entirely. But I think that's one of the things that I think we all have to think much more about. That in a sense, we can't just sort of jump to a simple policy fix or, here's a great PR strategy for the opposition. This kind of institutional infrastructure has to be thought. And I agree with Wolfgang that in a sense it's a typical move by populists that they weaken intermediary organizations, the media, but also parties, which supposedly have intra-party democracy. Both traditional media and inter-party democracy means that a certain degree of pluralism is going to be injected into the process. That no longer happens if you have a tweeter-in-chief who can basically connect directly with the people. And what you also don't have anymore is the role of intermediary institutions in simply slowing things down and giving you more time to consider different opinions. So that's kind of a more structural thing I would consider. Lastly, and this also goes to your question about what's going to happen, is this here to stay? I don't make predictions, especially not about the future, but I think it's important to get one thing about recent history right, which then also might be an important indication about the future and also in terms of strategy. Contrary to this very popular image of the populist wave, the allegedly unstoppable trend of our time, or as Nigel Farage, for whom the image of the wave was apparently of insignificant world historical meaning, the tsunami, as he put it, of populism, we have to, I think, remember that for the most part, this is still not really an autonomous force that, all of a sudden gains power everywhere. Farage didn't bring about Brexit. It was the Conservative Party who basically told people in the UK that Brexit is a jolly good idea. It wasn't a spontaneous grassroots movement of, as the cliche has it, angry white workers who carried Trump to the presidency. It was a very established party that nominated him and supported him until the very last day and still largely supports him today. So if we don't see that conservative enablers have been absolutely crucial, at least on the right side of the story, we're much more likely to be defeatist and say, oh, people just went crazy and now bring these demagogues to power and there's nothing we can do. Whereas many of us, I assume, have enough of a link to these much more established conservative actors to basically, to put it very bluntly, if I may, to tell them, look, I understand why, from your point of view, Trump's tax cut is great news. But think of this other stuff. I can see why, from your point of view, Orban is great news for the German car industry. But think of this other stuff. And I won't spell out what this might mean in a context here. briefly on to should we be using this concept of populism at all? Very clear-cut answer. Yes and no. So, of course, you're completely right that this comes with a lot of baggage. There are lots of different important ways of understanding that word against the background of very different historical experiences. So obviously, in the US, populism means something very different, broadly speaking, than in Europe. And you, in a sense, you get into hot water immediately if you say things that clash with certain historical understandings. Plus, very obviously, this is a politically contested concept. It's one that, you know, has been instrumentalized for political purposes. All of this is true. At the same time, this is true for virtually all of our political concepts. So anybody can always instrumentalize something. Everything has a history. So if we basically had to say, okay, every single time we want to talk about democracy or liberty or equality, we have to start from scratch, and here's my new word, that with my enormous power as a professor I will now impose on the world, I don't think we get very, very far. So I think I agree that it can be, in a sense, problematic if you have like a 140-character version of what you're trying to say, but if you maybe have enough time to explicate the thought behind it and sort of construct an ideal type, and then people say, but look, you know, maybe we should call it something different, that's fine. I mean, I'm not insisting on the word. If you say, look, you know, this should much better be described as one-party authoritarianism with a popular justification, okay, I'm not invested in the particular ism as a word. And maybe lastly, and this sort of loops back into to the other question, in terms of sort of the role of the left. There's plenty one can criticize about the left. Don't get me wrong, but I think again there's maybe a tendency today to too quickly say, well, it's sort of all this is now partly our own fault because, you know, especially but not only in the US, we pushed identity politics too far, you know, and that provoked this backlash, and, you know, we don't really have any other solutions. We have no idea what to do about policy, but one thing we can really do ourselves, which is no longer to push for transgender toilets and all this sort of stuff. And with all due respect, I think that's profoundly wrong. It's empirically wrong. If you look at, you know, people who've done a lot of work on what really mattered in the 2016 elections, one thing is clear: transgender toilets did not matter one bit. I mean, the idea that all these guys in the South or whatever your cliched idea of you know, left behind places might be said, oh, you know, Clinton is great, but this toilet thing, you know, no, come on, this was not decisive in any shape or form. And more importantly, and this goes back to the question of minorities. I think it's important to remember that a lot of the movements that now are easily subsumed under identity politics can as easily be understood as movements for the protection of basic rights. I mean, Black Lives Matter is not really an identity construction project. It's people saying, I don't want to be shot. Me Too is not some great identity project. It's basically people saying, I don't want to be harassed and raped. So you can translate, you know, what supposedly is all about highly particular identities which outsiders can never understand into a kind of rights language where then the other side might still push back, but I think the way they have to justify their pushback changes significantly in terms of how they have to formulate their strategies.
But if we cannot talk about or cannot explain the emergence of right-wing populism as a reaction to something, maybe as a reaction to left-wing, I would not call it a reaction against left-wing, but I do see this is a reaction against at least two things. The one is, as you have said, Jan, technocracy, expertocracy on the one side, and let's call it hyper-liberalism. And this is something you feel in the discourses. The people do not, or a large sector of the people who feel not represented are reacting extremely negatively. And it is not occasionally that right-wing populists are mobilizing on these super liberal elites, and there is a reaction. Otherwise, we cannot really explain why, after 3 decades of neoliberal and hyper-liberal autocracy. You find the reaction across almost all countries in the West. We have to explain it. And it's not a question who is guilty, but it's a question of actio and reactio. This is what I meant.
Well, let me close. Thank you so much for such an intellectually provoking and passionate given lecture. Two things are clear. Well, the topic is not simple, and populism is not a sort of a crazy outburst of emotions that will consume itself. So there will be lots of things to talk about in the coming future. And I would like to reiterate to Michael that they have a permanent invitation to come back. So thank you so much. Thank you all for listening.